Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am Thomas Zimmerman, for those of you I have not met, and I oversee programming at the Pacific Council for International Policy. And I just wanted to thank you all so much for joining us here today for this conversation. For those of you who are not familiar with us as an organization, we focus on promoting international policy conversations in Los Angeles. And in particular, we try to highlight the ways in which what happens globally impacts us here in Southern California, as well as how what happens here reverberates around the world. And so I can't think of a more apt conversation than the one we're about to have here right now. If you are interested in becoming a member or taking part in more of our virtual programming, please visit us at pacificcouncil.org. But first, I just wanted to introduce Yu Siegel, who will be speaking on behalf of the Wende Museum. So take it away.
Thomas, thank you so much. Yeah, originally this panel was scheduled to take place at the Wende Museum today as part of our discussion series In Search of Our Times. Earlier panels addressed the power of culture, the history of forgetting, and roads and shortcuts to utopia. The idea for fact and fiction came, among other things, from a revealing press conference in January 2017, where Kellyanne Conway introduced the concept of alternative facts. Revealing because it explicitly illustrates the depth of our political, social, and cultural divide, where reality itself has become a highly contested and politicized affair. To speak about alternative facts is to refuse communication. So what can we do to restore a sense of shared experience of the world we are living in, so that we at least can discuss the issues that confront us, irrespective of our personal take? I hope this extraordinary interdisciplinary panel will provide inspiration for at least a broadening of our horizon. And I would like to thank the Pacific Council on International Policy, and especially Thomas Zimmerman and Moria Nacionales Tavoya for the great collaboration in preparing and organizing this panel. And hopefully it's the first of more to come. Thomas, back to you.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to start by introducing our moderator, who will be leading us through this conversation today. Kathryn Wagner is an art critic and journalist based here in Los Angeles, and she's a contributing editor for the art journal Mosmas and Contemporary Art Review, Los Angeles. She served as an art critic for LA Weekly from 2011 and 2017, and contributes to ArtNet News amongst a large number of local publications. So we are incredibly grateful to have her and all of our panelists joining us today. And with that, we will hand it over to them. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I think you did a good job giving an overview of what we're going to be talking about, that this is about, you know, facts and that space between fact and interpretation, and just understanding what it means to navigate mis and disinformation. And I wanted to say just before we get started that we welcome and encourage anybody to submit questions as we talk. You can use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen, and we won't get to those till the last 15 minutes, but we'll keep track of them as they come in. And I'm just going to start by introducing each panelist and giving them a little bit of time to talk about their work. Maybe we'll spend about 5 minutes, give 5 minutes to each of them, and then we'll all join together in a discussion about these issues. So the first person I want to introduce is Luke Matthews. He's a professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School and the co-director of the Rand Center for Applied Network Analysis. His work focuses on studying cultural diffusion on social networks, or that is, how people influence each other. He has also applied social network analysis, simulation models, and machine learning to mix qualitative, quantitative data. And yeah, Luke, we'd love to hear a little bit about what you're thinking about in your work.
Great, thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Tom and Yus, for the introductory remarks. I'm really thrilled to be here participating in this. So yeah, I work for the RAND Corporation. I'm a social scientist there. I'm an anthropologist is my training and perspective. And I've been involved in some of our truth decay related research. Truth decay is a term that we've been using a bit. We put out a publication on this concept, and similar to what Yus was just saying about a kind of breakdown in our society's discourse in terms of an ability to reach some kind of consensus about truth, and how do we rectify that. My research specifically has focused a lot on anti-vaccine beliefs and pro-vaccine beliefs, and how people understand vaccination decisions for children. And there's one of my findings is that there's kind of a broad correlation between beliefs that don't seem particularly related on the substance of them. So there's a lot of beliefs in side effects or conspiracy theories or just general distrust. But when we survey people or we look on social media, we find that if the beliefs are kind of anti-establishment, they'll kind of all go together, whether they're about vaccines or general conspiracy theories or what have you. And then the kind of other flip side of that, though, we find isn't like people who believe in evidence and truth per se, but the flip side tends to be people who have kind of a pro-science, kind of pro-establishment stance. Now, like science works, so generally they are more aligned with the truth. But I'll give you some examples of people who have this greater scientific reasoning or more pro-science stance. They'll also espouse beliefs in our surveys or on social media, like that the CIA did not run a fake vaccination campaign to try to find Osama bin Laden. That's absolutely true. The US government has admitted it. It was kind of a scandal when it happened. It was reported in major publications that actual vaccine workers were kicked out of places in South Asia because of this. But again, people who have higher education and more scientific reasoning and many other truthful views say, no, that's not the case when we ask them, right? Another example would be the same sorts of individuals will tend to say vaccinations can't possibly cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a rare actual complication of vaccinations. If you went to get a flu vaccine this year, there was probably on that document somewhere a question, have you ever had Guillain-Barré syndrome? So one of the ways that then I've been trying to address this from a policy standpoint is to think about how we can engage in a conversation that gets beyond, my side has evidence and your side doesn't, and we're right and someone else is wrong, and instead talk about things the way people are thinking about them. So trying to share a slide right now, which is a slide of a happy family having a picnic, and it says to keep your kids safe this summer so they can keep being themselves, and talk to a healthcare professional about vaccines for trusted advice. And so this is a slide that I designed, my team designed, but it's a mock-up of something that's very similar to what you would see on public health websites or in a doctor's office right now. And based on kind of what we've been finding, that what this decision is about for real people is a stance they have towards society, we might suggest like radically different kinds of messages that aren't false, they're true, but they're engaging with the conversation as people are thinking about it. So this is like an example of a mock-up of a kind of message one could use that's still pro-vaccine. We don't all agree about who you can trust, but we can all agree vaccines are safe and effective at keeping kids healthy. So to try to knock off and decouple the vaccination issue from all of these other issues about trust, which is another thing people have commented contributes to this polarization that, when everything is related to everything, it's impossible to reach agreement about anything. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And next I want to introduce Fara. She is an artist and an assistant professor of visual arts at University of San Diego. She's based in California. Her methods incorporate sculptural and performative means of achieving imagery that refigures the medium of photography around bodily experience. Her work is in public collections that include the J. Paul Getty Museum and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And Fara, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kathryn. I'm going to give you guys a little art history lesson. So I'll share my screen from the beginning. Here you go. So let me try to make this a little smaller. All right. So writing on truth and politics in 1967, Hannah Arendt observed that the chances of factual truth surviving the onslaught of power are very slim indeed. It's always in danger of being maneuvered out of the world, not only for a time, but potentially forever. She said, once facts and events are lost, no rational effort will ever bring them back. So this is a picture of a woman's face, photographed and then crudely erased by a world no longer able to accommodate what her politics represented. Both the photograph and the erasure are facts. And even if one or both were fabricated to support a human narrative, they're both actually facts of their time. This is a photograph of Lenin and Trotsky, and this is a photograph in which Trotsky has been erased. So you'll see Lenin and Trotsky here, and you'll see Lenin here, no Trotsky. Both, again, are true to the narrative of their political moment, even if the latter represents a violent kind of redaction of history. When we focus on the binary of fact and fiction in political life, we miss an opportunity to recognize the realities of perspectives and to foster a sense of cultural memory in which different truths dialogue. The problem with the Trotsky pictures is not in the creation of the second representation, it's located in the elision of the first truth, the idea that the second truth revises the first and erases it. So what art can do is to find more and more ways to disrupt representation in order that we see ourselves seeing ourselves. The act of looking should be active and self-aware. In the first of these paintings by Velázquez, because this is an old problem, there's no acknowledgement that the person painted was not indeed the Apostle Thomas, but was in fact a model. The painter wants us to transcend and to see an apostle. In the second picture here, Velázquez meets our eyes, and we know that the sitter's aware of us and represents a real person. In the third, building on that sense of seeing ourselves, Las Meninas, Velázquez paints not only the direct gaze of the Infanta, but also himself over here, and he's in the act of actually painting this representation and in reflections of other characters in the mirror. So this is a picture within a picture, and we have this play within the play. The mise en abîme is a constant strategy in representation, and it's usually used to show characters something they couldn't observe about their lives without seeing it abstracted in front of them. Sometimes it's not only the characters who learn about their lives, but the audience as well, as in the concerted efforts of dramatists such as Brecht in Germany and Meyerhold in Russia, who devised methods of making viewers aware that they were watching representations and consequently that their lives were full also of representations, the truth of which they could work to build or unbuild. It's really hard to see through representations when you're in them, so much that we still often buy into the history constructed with them. On the left here is a picture of a farm girl in the Volga in the 1930s, apparently super happy to be farming and constructing a new political reality. And it's part of the Soviet effort to get people on board with the program. As Americans, we see that. But on the right is Migrant Mother, a Dorothea Lange picture of a pea picker meant to represent the destitute lives of farmers as part of FDR's Farm Security Administration in order to get public support for the New Deal. And as Americans, as artists, it's hard to see that as propaganda. We still see it as a good picture of a hard time, and it's hard to see it as part of a political marketing process, especially if we're biased towards intervention programs such as the New Deal. Bias is really, really too easy in a world now with so many news sources, each also now a play within a play, as anchors just quote other news stations and Twitter and social media in a too endless of a kind of a solipsistic circuit. And this is not what we mean when we say we must see ourselves, and it's certainly not what we mean when we say we must see each other. We can't see how solipsistic this is because now political marketing doesn't arrive in one paper, but is networked, which creates even more opportunities for bias because of impenetrable algorithms that guide not only how we see, but what we see, to the exclusion of other representations. So the Wall Street Journal used to host a blue feed, red feed, so that we could represent the dichotomous realities in which Americans live and show the articles that would come up for those biased towards the left or the right on the same subject. This is one great difference between now and before. We do not share depictions, and we're therefore influenced by utterly different representational streams. With valid distrust of the institution designed to educate, protect, inform, and lead us, then we take the agency of our own representation into our own hands, into our phones, using them to document police brutality, sexual assault, and other breaches of our existence, let alone our well-being. But the avenues through which we communicate what we see now on our phones have institutions also behind them, in some of which we believe and in others of which we don't. So while it may be helpful to be able to report violence to the ACLU, an equal and opposite opportunity for unqualified observers to report what they find suspicious to the LAPD crops up to create a space for citizen surveillance unprecedented in the United States since the McCarthy era. So how do we learn to see that what we see need be questioned and patiently informed? So contemporary art has a function here, and for example, one of them is to reveal the apparatus behind representations, as with contemporary work by Paul Sepuya, where a viewer can see how the picture is made, the picture that they're looking at. Contemporary art's function can be to create space for others' voices in institutions, rather than to recognize opportunity only as signifying steps forward for oneself, such as Rafa Esparza's inclusion of his friend's work in the mud-bricked room he built at the Whitney in 2017. And contemporary art's responsibility here is not to miss the trees for the forest. In other words, to listen to the small picture rather than to assume that the big picture is anything but a treacherous fantasy for most people. So that, for example, the end game of populating a sculpture park with a sculpture critical of state-sanctioned murder doesn't end up missing the more personal reality that local Native peoples were actually murdered that way nearby and don't want to see some fancy depiction of their pain by an outsider. Contemporary art's function, finally, is to find some kind of intersectional reward for the hard work of training in critical thinking. That is an art practice like Zachary Drucker's that extends outside of galleries to work in commercial broadcasts as well, or other social practices that produce both for inside and outside the gallery sphere. So these are some of art's strategies that we can use as it works against Arendt's foreboding words to bring light to lost facts and events through effort, not only rational, but relational. And that's most of what I wanted to say. I'll give it back to you, Kathryn.
Thank you very much. And so finally, we have Todd Frazier. He's an associate professor of communications and the director of the Institute for Diversity and Empowerment at the Annenberg at USC. He's a cultural historian who explores the arts, political, and expressive cultures of the people of the African Diaspora in the United States and elsewhere. His research examines histories and current day dynamics of race and gender, cultural traffic and content, urban culture and life, and popular culture. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you again for including me in this fantastic and important discussion. I'll be pretty brief so we can move forward to having a conversation. My teaching and research broadly explore US political and popular cultures and the intersection of them, with specific focus on Black expressive cultures in the US and elsewhere. Part of what I focus on in my research, but especially in the classroom, is facilitating opportunities for students, community members to think about the role of art and media in US political and popular cultures, and especially in terms of thinking about the various kinds of entrenched myths and ideologies that are at work or that have been at work in US political and popular cultures. Beginning with thinking about US history, or histories, excuse me, and encouraging students to think about what are the facts, or what have been positioned as facts about US history, and then encouraging them to think about how have those facts come to be positioned as fact for them, right? What have been the different kinds of forms of cementing that as fact within their perspective about what has occurred, and then thinking about what has been omitted, thinking about the kind of work that has gone to position those particular kinds of either events and interpretations of those events as being the dominant. Part of what I'm invested in doing with my teaching and my research is thinking about the various ways that how fact has been a tool in many ways to buttress power. So this is not to say that actual events or things taking place, have not occurred, but it's in many ways, we have no relationship to quote unquote fact without interpretation. So there can be, for instance, a graduation, right? There can be students who graduate on that day at that specific time, but the meaning of that graduation, right, does not come from nowhere. That's socially produced. The fact that we even call it a graduation, right? And that we position particular people and bodies as mattering on that specific day is tied to the work of social construction, right? So in many ways, that's what we spend a lot of time talking and discussing. The fact, or the reality that what's positioned as the reality that matters, right? There's work that goes into that. There are power dynamics that go into that, and that there are various other things that happen that might not be included in that narrative, right? That there are language, there are systems of meaning and communication that have come to do that work of presenting something, quote unquote, as fact, right? So when we, for instance, use terms, you know, for instance, the Kellyanne Conway statement of alternative fact, you know, alternative facts and fake news. So in interrogating those terms, part of what I would do with students is say, well, before we can even begin with the concept of alternative facts and fake news, let's deal with news and fact, because what's unstated in the term of, you know, alternative fact and fake news is, you know, real fact, real news, right? To suggest that news and fact indicate truth-telling, you know, truth uncovering. And part of what the work we do in the classroom is to think about is, no, how do news and fact, you know, by themselves as terms, how do they work to signify power, right? That news and fact, you know, in many ways, or what has been historically situated as news and newsworthy, you know, has worked to reinforce particular kinds of economic and ideological interest of particular groups, right? So, you know, if we think back, goodness, to just, you know, over 150 years ago, there were, you know, facts or presumed facts about people of color or women, which helped to buttress white supremacy, and that helped to buttress patriarchy, right? That biological racism was buttressed in certain arguments about scientific fact, which, you know, of course, over time have been disproven, but nonetheless, in their time, in their moment, they worked to do particular kinds of work in terms of justifying the economic and the social exploitation of particular groups, right? So part of the work we go into thinking about is like, what kind of work went into producing certain kinds of facts that legitimize, for instance, the war on crime or the war on drugs? What kinds of, you know, messages were presented as facts, which helped to cement, you know, and support arguments about, you know, weapons of biological weapons in Iraq, which then produce, you know, the war on terror and the Patriot Act? You know, what kinds of facts about criminality? How does data get positioned in order to produce discourses and policies that racialize particular groups and criminalize particular groups, right? So it's doing the kind of work in terms of thinking about the politics of interpretation and the politics of representation. That in many ways, creating this kind of binary of fact and fiction negates the kind of politics and the work that goes into situating something as fact, situating particular kinds of perspectives, experiences as fact over that of others. And this is not to say that there is no kind of actual event, there is no real thing. There is there are real things, there are real actual events. But what also really matters is our interpretation of that thing, you know, or what are the dominant kind of interpretations of that thing, and what kind of work does that do in reinforcing particular kinds of power dynamics, as well as like what kind of work happens, you know, whether it be by artists, you know, alternative media, in encouraging us to cultivate a more critical interrogation of these politics of interpretation, these politics of representation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I feel like you just, at the end there, you got to a lot of the questions that I want to dig more into. And maybe just starting, like Taj just made it really clear that fake news and alternative facts aren't new phenomena. So I know that all three of you look to history in your work. And I wanted to ask, you know, how does looking back and examining these past eras help us understand what we're experiencing now with dis and misinformation?
I can offer some response.
Yeah.
One era that some of my colleagues and I have thought about is kind of the early development of journalism and sort of what was called yellow journalism. That was very kind of like we call it today clickbaity, and a lot of it was linked to kind of propaganda, right? And then kind of investigative journalism emerged out of that, and a more professional kind of journalism. And so what shifted was the community of journalists coalesced around some kind of standards of what are the processes you need to do to generate what we're going to call journalism or news, right? What are the kinds of trainings you need to have? And so, there's a certain kind of gatekeeper effect. It was no longer just anybody being a journalist, but I think that there was an improvement there, right? And one of the things we're struggling with the kind of alt-fact world is that there's a good thing. I really think it's a good thing that we've democratized some of the production of information through social media and the internet and so forth, right? But also anybody can just set themselves up, like Alex Jones, is one of my favorite foils, right? Who was most recently promoting toothpaste with colloidal silver in it to cure coronavirus, okay? Do not buy toothpaste with colloidal silver. It does not work, and it's possibly quite dangerous, right? Do not ingest silver. So what I mean is Alex Jones has absolutely no formal credentials or like journalistic process that he uses to generate his content.
I think it's really interesting to think about this. And your question was about history, but it's also interesting to think about it specifically with respect to the news. Benedict Anderson talks about the creation of nationalism and nationalisms as being tied to print capitalism, to the idea that, we saw ourselves embodied in pieces of paper that depicted the news, represented the news to us. And therefore we began to see ourselves as groups, let alone countries, tribes. And I think in this current moment, much as it's wonderful that the process has become democratized, as I was trying to point out in some of my slides, the idea now is that these tribes aren't creating only nationalisms, but because there are so many networked news sources, true or not, they do create true tribes. And so the notion of the information being factual is almost less important than the kind of phenomenon of real tribalism happening, being generated around kind of media capitalisms instead of per se print.
And thinking about that link, in terms of thinking about that through Benedict Anderson's work about imagined communities, this tie between both the construction, hundreds of years ago in terms of, national identity and the development of capitalism, and today, the same kind of development, how it's embedded in a market logic, but tied to creating an even narrow kind of ecosphere of ideas and shared values that are still reinforce a particular kind of sense of, ownership and governing over, the nation, even within the nation. But that work to, cultivate even, that work to even kind of redefine and cultivate their own standards of, what truth is, and in many ways, truth being situated for the shared interest. So even when presented with, alternative counter kind of arguments, the idea being, sure, all these ideas can exist, but because these ideas work in our interest, those are privileged, without even thinking about the relationship between that and, an agenda tied to, sustaining humanity and the species. That in many ways it's very much rooted in a historical logic, I would argue, among some, about centering their positionality, over that of others.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition to a question that I think I stole from Fara, actually, which is that the question of whether fake news is even a helpful term, and this issue of positionality, like how do we talk about news and documentary images in a way that acknowledges subjectivity and biases are always present? Is art a way to do that? Do we need to do that?
Well, I think it's been part of the power dynamics of of journalism, in many ways, that in order, part of situating the institution in the field and its practices within, constructs of objectivity, historically has worked, in favor of situating it as a practice that is extremely separate and different from that of quote unquote art. And sure, there are differences, but part of what that works to reinforce is a notion of the artist as being subjective and rooted in a particular kind of identity, and the journalist as being able to kind of transcend that, which isn't the case. We carry our identities wherever we are. The languages in which we use, that has been shaped from somewhere, and to not acknowledge that, in many ways works against us, removing the veil of power.
Right. I mean, there's bias in every writing, right? There's bias in the writing of a recipe. If I tell you how to make a cake and I use cups as a measurement, I'm biased towards my system of measurement, and I may not even think about that as I make my cake, right? So no matter how factual the kind of representation purports to be, there is bias. Now, some of these biases are more or less dangerous, obviously, and art's role, as I was trying to point out in my little lecture, may for the most part be to kind of create avenues for people to become more critical viewers of the representations that will continue to come at us from not only journalism, but marketing, and marketing that we agree with and marketing that we don't. And agreements also shift, right? We may shift our understanding of what was actually an appropriate piece of propaganda to issue forth for any particular era. So art has had that role for a very long time, this role of creating criticality or fostering it. But I don't think that that's enough right now, because there is so much distrust of institutions. You can't simply put viewers in front of Paul Sapuya and expect them to understand that they're supposed to disrupt the apparatus of identity. It's not going to happen. And I think that is a question for history as well. I mean, when you look back to the Soviet period and all the socialist realism painting that was coming out of that period by force, there were a lot of arguments as socialist realism was developing as to whether or not people should be more conceptual and be more kind of constructive of critical thinking, or whether they should be quite literal about and use allegory to communicate almost in the way that we do now through marketing. So like Luke's slides about vaccines are allegorical to some extent. We know exactly how we're supposed to feel about happy families, and maybe we should feel that way about vaccines. So yeah, I mean, I think history can show us ways in which that's fruitful, and does help to communicate a political program, but also ways in which that, once codified, becomes problematic.
Do either of you want to respond to that? Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I can pose it as a question.
No, sure, I will. I mean, I'm in agreement. I think, it's not the work of artists or media makers or, people whose work is tied to cultivating a greater kind of critical media literacy. It's not their work alone in order to produce a different kind of, publics to assess, the proliferation of images and narratives that we consume. I mean, I think in many ways we have to cultivate a different kind of ethical mission, societal ethical mission and commitment, that will then shape the kinds of representations, information production that people, are receiving. In many ways, I think that's a different kind of pedagogical mission. I mean, when we are operating in a society where market logic, obviously there are other logics, but a market logic rules in many ways, you know. I mean, for instance, you know, right now, New York Times, various publications are offering, you know, you don't have to subscribe to open and get access to the articles that are COVID-19 related, right? Fantastic. What if they were to take that same kind of approach to all of the stories that they publish, right? That doesn't work in their interest in terms of reaching their economic benchmark. And as a result, there is information that people who are either not willing to pay or can't pay will not receive, right? So what does it mean when we're operating in a society, for the most part, where information has been privatized, right? And where individuals are positioned, first and foremost, as economic citizens, and where they fit in on the hierarchy then determines, you know, what they get access to. And that's just not just information, that's in terms of healthcare, that's in terms of education, a variety, right? So when the ethical mission is so tied and rooted in a particular kind of, you know, economic focus, then that you know, helps to feed. I mean, you think about it, the media economy then feeds both off of the tribalism, but it also feeds into it, right? It feeds into it because the articles that are receiving the most clicks, the companies who are willing to pay, you know, more money are at the top of the algorithmic chain over other sources, community-based sources that are offering, you know, contending responses and ways of thinking about that same issue or that same event.
Yeah, what I wanted to offer is that I in reaction to Fara's comments, is that I totally agree with the notion that art can create this needed criticality, which I think is, you know, from my vantage point as a social scientist, related to possibility, right? So as a kind of quantitatively oriented social scientist, right? My approach to science using a kind of formal scientific method, what a formal scientific method is about is adjudicating among hypotheses, right? And eliminating them and deciding which ones have a better correspondence to the way things are. Where you can get your hypotheses wherever you want. And that's what I mean by possibility, right? And what concerns me about when I run these surveys is that on that kind of pro-science end, I sometimes see a closed offness to possibility. And then I wonder also though, if Fara, Taj have thoughts about the potential for art, like not just art used as propaganda, but art to create a shared understanding or a shared experience. I mean, Fara referenced those videos of police brutality, for example. I think those have been actually really constructive, right? We all have limited social worlds, right? And so I think for quite a few white people in America, right, who have never had those kinds of interactions with the police, right, it's created a kind of shared, a greater form of shared experience that they can see these videos and be like, oh, that's what African Americans have been talking about, right?
Right. I mean, I think in many ways, the art or even the representation, for instance, you know, the recordings of, you know, police violence or these kinds of moments where you see just the kind of differences that occur in terms of, you know, people's interactions with the police, that it can produce a kind of opening of, oh, wow, what people have been saying, okay, there's truth to that, right? Which is an important kind of beginning. But in many ways, I believe the leap is in cultivating more robust and expansive spaces for conversation, exchange beyond that, right? That in acknowledging that as a reality that's important, but without situating that reality in a long history of experiences that were not recorded and were not recorded, you know, obviously strategically and on purpose. And even when they were recorded, the record was used to like both reinforce, you know, the power dynamics. You know, I mean, for instance, lynchings being turned into like postcards, like that was the popular culture of the 1920s, 1930s, you know, that people, it was a record that wasn't used to prove, wow, they're treating, you know, these folks terribly. It was a record to say like, look, this reinforces my identity. This reinforces, you know, that I might be working class or poor and white, but what I am not is that, you know, and that in many ways, without having a kind of conversation and a serious kind of rethinking of of who's been included in the record, you know, and like what's been included in the record. And the fact that even when we have these kinds of records, they have not produced a kind of shift, you know, or drastic shift in the, in power dynamics or even the logics of power, right? You know, then people have to even rethink, like, you know, it's important that we have this recording, but when we recognize that in many ways, the recordings have not produced vast shifts in terms of, you know, decisions that are made within the legal system, that people can have these recordings and nonetheless, we've seen folks acquitted on multiple occasions, right? Without thinking about like what kind of trauma are these recordings doing to the people who constantly have to see them, you know, and revisit them, you know, without that kind of conversation, you know, and without that kind of psychological kind of unpacking and work, you know, I in many ways the question is like, what is the kind of real benefit of the data? We have this data, you know, but the data has not produced a transformation of the power structure.
Right. It creates a kind of an avenue for people to be able to, again, according to tribe, and again, according to algorithm, say, aha, well, the ACLU created an app that enables us to kind of report on the police. I will give money to the ACLU, and that's my contribution to this problem. It also creates a kind of an atmosphere in which, you're right, there's a re-experience of constant violence and trauma in communities that really don't need to see any more of trauma inflicted upon themselves. And you see a lot of kind of discussion of that in arts worlds, kind of reauthoring of these things. So that if someone, you know, takes in the cultural data of these videos, makes a painting, puts it in a museum, or as in the case of the Sam Durant sculpture that I showed, you know, takes in all the data of all the ways that the US has sanctioned, you know, capital punishment, and wants to reissue it as a cultural product so that we spend more time with it, and so that it doesn't represent only possibility, but also conversation. Well, that's very well intentioned, but, you know, in the case of the person repainting a traumatic video of, or photograph of violence on Black lives, or the case of the sculpture about state-sanctioned violence with respect to Native Americans, they're not actually thinking about that audience walking into the museum or walking into the sculpture park, being Native, seeing the structure that killed their forebears, being Black, seeing the you know, Black death again. And so what art has to do is take that data, reauthor, but consciously with respect to its audience and with respect to permissions, and to really ask more questions of itself rather than just assume that by outputting re-representations of problematic social spheres, we're contributing in some way, because that's no different than just giving money to the ACLU, you know. It's a little different.
No, I think it's really important to think about both what the work is doing, but also the as Fara brings up, the infrastructure and the environment through which the art or the imagery or the representation is presented, and where it circulates and for whom it circulates, right? So if it's a work of art that's painted and positioned in a museum and gallery, there's a particular kind of work it can do, but there's also has to be acknowledgement of the both social boundaries and hierarchies that exist within the art world, you know, that this is art that oftentimes is produced for the economic, you know, art marketplace, right? And whose interest, you know, I mean, obviously multiple interests can be served at once, but whose kind of economic interest does that serve? And even in the case of like videos, you know, when these videos exist on a platform like Facebook, you know, the recirculation of these videos, you know, works in the economic interest of the platform at the same time, right? Oftentimes, so, you know, for instance, earlier this week, it was the public's outcry with the circulation of the video of Ahmaud Arbery, in many ways, I believe, played a role in the Georgia district attorneys, you know, then moving forward in terms of charging the two men, right? So the public did important work both in the circulation of the imagery and the sharing of the story, as well as in terms of calling in, right? Which is important. But there also is acknowledgement in terms of that there's an economic, like we were simultaneously also, working on Instagram's behalf. I mean, they benefit from us recirculating these kinds of images. And that if there's no rethinking of, without that video, would this even be a name that we know? Speaks, I think, to even a broader issue of, power dynamics at a play that work to kind of even have silenced the story over the last 2 months.
So can I kind of pose a question? I'm curious what Fara and Taj think about, like, where would you bound the limits on the cui bono, who benefits argument? Because we see this all the time from conspiracy theorists, not just on the left, but also on the far right, right? So like the latest idea that coronavirus was started by Bill Gates so that he could then massively respond and make his foundation look good, which if we were living in a Bond movie would be plausible, but it's a who benefits argument, right? Similarly, a man just last month literally derailed a freight train to try to destroy a hospital ship in LA that we sent to help, right? I could go on, right? Like, but how do you put limits on that and limit it from being just complete speculation of, well, I come up with a person who benefits, so.
I want to say really quick, I think that's a great question, and I want to hear what Taj and Farah have to say about it. But I also want to tell the attendees that we're going to open up the Q&A soon. And if you would like to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, I know some of you joined after I said this at the start, you can type your question in there. And after we address Luke's question, we'll move on to those of you who are in the audience.
I think the question of value is yeah, it's very tricky in this current atmosphere of distrust. I don't know any institution that feels as if that seems as if it has kind of earned total trust, right? Like I have a friend, and I've brought this up before in prior Wende panels. I think I have a friend who organized a really important kind of conference at the New Museum in Queens. They had put a panel together, many panels with community organizers and artists and people from all walks of life. She had been really kind of focused on incorporating races, ethnicities, sexual identities, gender identities, all kinds of people from the community to come talk, but she hadn't really thought about the land that they were using. And so this land was contested as far as, value to the community, and somebody from the community showed up and stopped the entire conference by suggesting that the person who was going to value at the end of the day, the institution that was going to, increase its value at the end of the day was the New Museum. They were on land that the New Museum needed. And so we needed to boycott this entire conference. And in fact, the conference closed. And so all of those people who hadn't yet had a seat at a table to discuss the way New York was going to reorganize itself in an architectural future, in this particular case, none of them got that seat at the table. So there was a real loss on the one hand, because all of these people with minds and who had been waiting to contribute couldn't anymore. But the community was no longer interested in showing up on someone else's terms. And so who benefits became just like the baseline of participation. If the museum's going to benefit and take our land away from us, we're not showing up. We're not going to even ascribe value to the table you've given us a seat at. And so I think that as we discuss like the different kinds of tribes that news organizations in this new networked reality create, we have to start there in the tribalism rather than starting with the individual facts we want to promote, because the tribes aren't getting together anymore, to even have a conversation.
Oh, Taj, are you
Oh,
talking?
sure. And I think that point in terms of thinking about, yeah, the power dynamics, the construction of the table, the metaphorical table. So obviously, multiple parties can benefit simultaneously. So it's not to say that even when I'm using that kind of example of people sharing things online, how that, serves Instagram's, monetary interest. They can do that while at the same time working in the interest of the organizations who've been trying to, galvanize people around this story and even more broadly around these particular issues. But I think in many ways it gets to encouraging people not to blind themselves to the infrastructure in which we're all participating in, sharing information in, and thinking about, the different interests that are at play. As well, I would say many organizations now are prioritizing, even in terms of the terminology and the discourses they use, working on campaigns to utilize the technology, and the approaches of the kind of infrastructure, for instance, of digital platforms in their interest, right? So recognizing that particular organizations or particular movements, for instance, the fact that, like we said, alternative fact and fake news, these have become, buzzwords, key terms that, now when you type them in, there are particular stories which are at the top of the list. There was a lot of work that's gone into that in the aftermath of working to define that in particular ways, that when, a person who has gone to these web pages in this place prior, there are certain stories that are presented for them that are not presented for me, right? So being more critical, number one, of that infrastructure and how it works in many ways to position you, the user, in a way that will, as Fara points out, network you and connect you to particular organizations, particular interests, while at the same time reproducing certain kind of boundaries from that outside of it, right? I think that's extremely important in terms of thinking about the infrastructure, number one, through which information is produced, shared, consumed, remixed, that it's not, now, people now are using TikTok. TikTok has had to rethink even its own platform because there's fake news being shared on TikTok, about COVID, right? So, in many ways, if your child is on this platform, and you're unaware, they are also now potentially consuming, misinformation, right? So I think part of that's what's extremely important too, is thinking about the infrastructure. And at times, this kind of goes to one of the first points earlier, we need to have a different kind of value system that's shaping both our relationship to platforms, but even in terms of the design of the platforms. If there's no acknowledgement and recognition of the various ways that bias, and especially, bias that is not being acknowledged shapes even the design, and I think that has to do with the digital platforms, but even when I think about data, social science, this kind of investment in terms of thinking about the criteria or the terminology we use in terms of cultivating, our research subjects. If we're not thinking about the terms that have been privileged in terms of defining particular groups, we can miss out on a great deal, even in terms of how we study, how we explore those particular groups, their relationship to whatever that question or subject is.
Yeah,
I
think.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to move to a question which is very related to what Taj just said, so it might actually lead into what you were going to say, Fara. This question came in: what practical steps can we as news consumers do to change our approach to how we get our news so we aren't spreading bad information ourselves? And it seems like that criticality.
Sure. So I would say first off, and I have to remind myself of this all the time, before we repost something or recirculate something, like stepping back, I think for some people, and especially something that ties into where they stand politically and how they view the world, some of us have an immediate reaction to reshare that, and I think it is important for a number of stories to be reshared and circulate, but I also think we have to work to be still, to think about, first off, who is the source that we received this from? You know, is it a source that, you know, is it a, number one, is it a source that has produced a record of trying to have and be clear about what are its criteria in terms of number one, identifying and producing stories, but also in terms of the kind of work that they're doing by circulating this kind of information in these stories, right? And so I think there's number one, a kind of sense of like, who is the organization, you know, and what kind of values are shaping the work that they do, and are they clear and vocal about those values, as well as do they hold themselves accountable when they're wrong?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot of all of that, but there also needs to be a lot of consciousness of the ever shifting and developing kind of constructs of contemporary news, so that you know, we're looking always now for this kind of first person testimony in our news. I had my child stolen by a dog and this is how I reacted, or I was hit by a car and this is how I reacted. So there's a lot of like use of the first person to imply transparency in headlines. It's all over the place. It's and it's really a ploy to get us to trust what we're reading, and to imagine that there isn't an institution behind it, that it's actually coming from the ground up. And it contributes to a lot of gotcha journalism in the end. So being aware of constructs that are kind of playing out a little bit too much, and comparing them to the kind of journalism that is actually designed to be transparent. You know, the kind of creative nonfiction that doesn't purport to journalism, but that does own the eye of the writer. For example, like a piece by Masha Gessen in the New Yorker. You will always know exactly where she's coming from as a writer. She's a woman who has left Russia to live with her wife in America and to teach here and to write here, and all of her writing comes from this place where you are acknowledging not only the source. It's not just the New Yorker, it's her. Like where is this perspective coming from? So it's trust of institutions, but you know, I trust the New York Times, but I also really I notice their erasures and their elisions of their kind of the things they leave out in a lot of their news. And so I've lost trust in them to some extent. So I think that we have to be careful readers in terms of what's not there as much as what's there, and careful readers in terms of tropes that just seem to kind of recur too much. And then to be very aware of the kinds of audiences they appear to expect to have, because they have marketing teams behind them. You know, however kind of neutral they purport to be, they have marketing teams that are very aware of the kinds of audiences they think are their readership, and they're gearing it towards it. Is it news that's just coming up in your algorithm? Can you Google it and look for the alternative news sources and see what they're saying about it, even when it's clearly crazy? Like, I love being at the gym and seeing, well, no longer, but when I used to go to the gym before the coronavirus, you know, you'd see CNN and you'd see Fox News on the TV, and they'd be talking about the same story, but totally differently. Or you'd see Fox News not talking about a story that CNN was talking about. And again, that kind of omission is a political move. So it's interesting then to leave the gym and know that Republicans are not hearing what the Democrats are hearing. And that's a problem. You know, so looking for erasure by looking at a news source you're not actually interested in is another strategy.
Yeah, I want to close soon because we've just passed 4 o'clock, but I also want to give Luke a chance to respond. And then if Taj and Farah, if you also have some closing comments, we'll take some time for that as well.
Just on the question that was asked, which was excellent. I mean, concrete step I would say is I'm of the view that social communities of people can do good things. That's also social communities of experts, scientific experts, medical experts, so forth. So I think on average, you will do well to trust experts, but make sure that you're only trusting experts when they're speaking about their expertise. Right? So one thing that like all of us experts love to do is we'll just answer any question. my economist colleagues will start rolling over at Rand and getting spun up, right? Because I'll just start answering questions about economics, but I'm not actually an economist, right? So trust experts when they're speaking within their expertise, I think is a good thing to do if you want to get to better decisions.
I would say, I mean, one thing I'll add too is thinking about, kind of to my point I was making earlier, the economic interest or that's motivating particular platforms, especially in terms of what stories they prioritize, what issues they prioritize. And to Fara's point, thinking about who they imagine their readership is, both, especially in terms of class and educational background. I think, to me, that's an important piece, that there are particular institutions that have been able to, you know, the New York Times is the New York Times because they have been a gatekeeper. They've historically been able to position themselves in particular kinds of ways that, you know, a local community organization without the same resources cannot. But I would argue that oftentimes the experts are people who are on the ground in particular spaces and communities. I think, you know, if we look at just Ferguson and the Ferguson community's uprising in response to the murder of Michael Brown and the ways that the police department came out to enforce, you know, the people returning to their homes, you know, it was the people on the ground in Ferguson, you know, through platforms like Twitter, who were offering a counter perspective to that of CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, who's said, you know, in many ways, the experts are wrong. The stories that the experts are telling about what's happening on the ground are inaccurate, right? So I would say there's an importance of being able to balance our consumption, both with the kind of dominant platforms, the dominant institutions who at times, you know, even when they're looking for stories, will rely upon people like me or reach out to people like me to comment about, or other people, you know, at particular organizations to comment about something that's happening in a particular place, as opposed to the people who are in that space and place and who've been doing the work in that space and place for some time. So I think it's important for us to not just rely upon one source, but to look for multiple sources, especially sources that have a tangible connection to what that issue is, whose lives in many ways are directly impacted by it.
Yeah, and I think that spending more time, as I think you said earlier, Taj, and with respect to one of your ideas, spending more time with any one article is really, really important. Art helps us to spend time with ideas because it unpacks it. But even if you want to stay within the media sphere, because the problem with any source, whether it's from the New York Times or a local paper or blog, is that they will all claim to be experts. And there are self-help gurus out there right now who literally lead workshops saying, you don't need to be an expert to be an expert. People need to believe that you're an expert. And there are people who are training to be perceived as such. Now, Luke is an expert in his field.
Right, he's a real expert.
He is an expert, but we need to be able to, as consumers, spend more time with these people so that if they put on a doctor's coat and some glasses, we're not perceiving them as experts when in fact there's less there to back up their claims, right? So time,
yeah, slowing down.
Yeah.
Which hopefully this time has afforded some of us more to do, to slow down.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, it was wonderful to spend time with all of you and I don't know, there's so much more to say, but this was at least a generative start to these conversations.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. All right, I'll end it here and stay well, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.